Okay, so a couple of things. The question is, this first part was, if you know your water is higher pH, and the first answer to that is the pH of water has little to nothing to do with this, but the alkalinity of the water, you know, because I can have water that's a pH of 9 that won't bother my soil at all. Our water is a pH of 7 when it comes out of the tap, but it's the dissolved lime, which is different than pH. That's another class to do, but you know, it's the alkalinity, the dissolved bicarbonate or carbonate alkalinity in there. So could you do something about that from like a compost standpoint is really what you're asking. And
right, if you're concentrating more on like pine needle mulch or
okay.
other sources of more acidity.
I have yet to see, I have read in many books that oak leaf compost is more acidic or that pine needle compost is more acidic. I have yet, I've tested samples and used those to see where that is the case. So I think that's another one of those things that somebody wrote in a book once and a bunch of other people reproduced it. Just like I'm going to tell you about worms, there's a lot of information about worm compost that isn't true either. But there are some times when in an environment, you know, where you can get that acid forming, you know, under pine trees, but it may or may not be have to do with the needles decaying. It may have a lot more to do with the sandy soil or other stuff happening there. But that still doesn't take away from your idea of could you make something that's more acidic? Generally, compost, I've yet to find an acidic compost. You know, in the early stages of compost, it goes up, 7, 8 during active composting. And then as the compost matures, it comes down, all right, down into the 7s and the 6s. That may be months. You know, we have stuff that's several years old. I have my compost museum, you know, that I have stuff that's like 7, 8 years old, you know, and you know it comes down usually within the year or so, and you just have to wait for that compost to mature is usually the issue. But you can, I've added sulfur to the compost pile and made more acidic compost that way. I've added peat to the compost pile and made more acidic compost that way. Those are very valid things that you can do. But you can also just add those right to the bed, you know, and bring the pH down that way. But for the most part, we often don't have to do too much there. We're doing a little bit in the 30s and 40s when they started composting food waste. They were doing some anaerobic composting of food waste, and under anaerobic composting conditions, the pH goes down pretty low. All right, but anything you do organic has to be aerobic. And I heard Elaine talk when I was in Minnesota, and like if she didn't said once, she said at least 100 times aerobic compost. Okay, and if it's not aerobic, it's not compost. And I don't quite agree with that. I think, you know, when we get back to composting more food waste, which we will do very soon, all that went away, all the work from the 30s and 40s, because they opened landfills and said, oh, we don't have to do this anymore. Let's just dump all the food waste in the landfills. So we like lost a lot of that. We didn't use that knowledge, but now everybody wants to keep the food waste out of the landfills. I'm hoping in the next 5 years, you guys are going to have either food waste compost, or you're going to be bringing food waste to your farm to compost, and we're going to keep those nutrients out of the landfill. But that's a different story. But there are things you can do. There's bokashi and EM and other things that we can't talk about today about how to manage that composting process. Let's just look real quick what's going on compared to our fields. So the front ones are the fields. We are continuing to go up, 2 6s, 2 9s, 3 7s. Jeremy is rightfully so very proud of this. With, you know, good management, these soils are coming up. But our tunnels, see, we're much higher. We're in, you know, 6, 7, and 8 in the tunnels. All right, cation exchange capacity also higher in the tunnels than in the field, but holding stable, maybe increasing a little bit in the field. Phosphorus, as I showed you, we've got good phosphorus availability in our fields. That early when we started the farm had just started the compost facility on campus. I went there, they were doing the dairy manure. I said, I'd like to have some of that. They said, okay, you know, we'll charge you $50 a truckload to haul it down there, you know, a mile away. And it's like, sorry, I don't have any money. So 3 months later, when their piles were growing bigger and bigger and bigger, they said, would you like some of that compost? And I said, yeah. And they started hauling, and it's like they brought me like 1,000 cubic yards of this stuff because they didn't know what to do with it at the time. Unfortunately, I said, okay, I can handle this. And over time, Andy Fogel and I, we got it spread all over the farm, and we were doing like rates 40 to 60 tons to the acre, which most farms can't do, and I wouldn't recommend. I'm not recommending that anybody do that, but it got us off to a good start, and we've had plenty of phosphorus ever since. We have not, now we have a cycle that's just cover crops and 10 ton to the acre twice in a 7-year cycle, with a dairy type compost, and we're learning how to do that efficiently. But this is, method that seems to be working for us to keep the phosphorus up. I got to remember that they're videotaping this, and it's like, what do I admit to and what I don't admit to? Okay, soil pH, we're holding good here, all right, and in our fields, we're holding good. We have, again, the heavy soils are going to remain pretty stable. Potassium is something that we're watching for how do we balance that and make sure that we keep that up. It's another key part of the nutrients. And then calcium in these comparisons, again, coming up more in the tunnels than in the field. So I'm hoping that this is going to be a useful data set as more people get more time in the tunnels. There's still only a handful of us that have been growing in tunnels here in the Midwest for more than 10 years. The last conference I was at, there was somebody who's got like 12, 14 years going. But that's my job, is to be out ahead and anticipate things so that when you get to having tunnels that long and we start getting more and more tunnels, which I think we're going to have, that you don't get into trouble. Is this helping to paint a picture for you? Let's go to the question in the back there.
Yeah, so if you have a stationary hoop house, which I have a couple, I've had it for 2 years, should we be applying animal-based compost?
Everything I know would say no. Okay, that doesn't mean there's not some that you can't figure out a way to do that, but clearly Elliot Coleman has said no for 20 years. Steve Moore, that was his experience, and that would be, my experience. I haven't done it, so I don't have data to say if you do, this is what's going to happen. But the biggest risk is involved in bringing the nitrogen up too high. That phosphorus coming up high is generally not a problem for the plants, okay? But as the nitrogen comes up, that's where you're going to get soft, rapid growth and greater susceptibility potentially to diseases, to stresses, insects. Most people I can remember 10 years ago repeating what farmers said, that with high nitrogen you get aphids, and you get, the entomologists didn't really like that too much, but more and more people are saying and getting away, that high nitrogen, you're going to see more aphids, and I've seen that in our tunnels, when we get too carried away. I tell that story of the very first tunnel stuff that I did in those boxes that I mentioned. I got to get a picture of this in this talk. Back in '94, is I had brought in all this soil that we had composted and then put in there. Stuff was growing fine, and I had this lunch that was like 10 days away, okay? And first time ever I was growing food for a conference. It was one of the first conferences that they were buying local food down on campus. And it's like, I got to have enough. And it's like, I went in there with some fish fertilizer and fertilized it. And it's like the aphids went, and it's like we spent 6 hours washing that lettuce to get rid of all the aphids, And it's like, all I had to do was just like, relax, John, it's going to be fine, And that's where it's like you just have to learn, to understand your crops and not rush things so much. And for me, that was a big process, but I have a lot of confidence now. It's like, don't push it, and you do not want to get too much nitrogen in that system.
So are you going to ruin it if you use it for the first couple of years and then stop? Or?
I would say one time when I'm building the soil. Let me show you some more examples of what we do. I got to think about my time here. These are those polyline beds that have been in production for 16 years. And look at the organic matter is like 15%. The pH is holding okay because we adjust that. But in here we're like 400 ppms of P. In the field, if you get over 300 ppms of P, you can't put any more on there. It's against the law. So this is building up. But here, the potassium, where in our other beds, this is a concern. Here, we've got it built up pretty good. Calcium is up high. Magnesium is very high. All right, but the crops still grow really good in there. I'm just going to skip this one, and I'm going to skip this one. We already told this salt removal thing. All right, so if you do need to manage the nutrients, I've got some more stuff on my website about this, but essentially you have choices in an organic system between using plant-based, mineral-based, or animal-based. And the mineral-based are these ones that we've already talked about, gypsum, rock phosphate, and lime, and you learn how to use those appropriate. The animal-based are blood meal, feather meal, bone meal, all right, and dried blood. I'm okay with these things. Some people are concerned about, are you going to put something in there you don't want? Some people want to grow veganically, and it can clearly be done. Vegan soil management is definitely a possibility. But you don't want to get too much of that because it's going to be much higher nitrogen. And then the plant-based, alfalfa meal, soybean and cotton and corn meal are most people, organic growers, are not looking at because of all the GMO material. But alfalfa has been okay. Now we got GMO alfalfa in their infinite wisdom. But some of these other things are also possibilities. Wood ash is a great source of nutrients, but it's a super high lime. So you probably do not want to use that unless your pH is low. I still have several 50-gallon barrels of wood ash at home that I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to use. And if you read in the 1855 yearbook of or Encyclopedia of Agriculture, they talk about, if you add water to it, it goes from an oxide to a hydroxide, and you leave it exposed to the air, it should go to a carbonate. So I'm testing that to see. I've got some that I've wet, and we'll see whether we can use those ashes at some point. But this alfalfa is one that I can clearly recommend. It does quite good. And you can get it in a variety of forms, but this is now being sold more as tasty tomato, but as mentioned in the materials. All right, and I've given you some rates in your handout too about what we used, and we've used this for transplant production. So we are not using it currently because we're getting plenty of nitrogen from our leaf mold compost and from our other compost, which I'm going to show you. I would not recommend cover crops. They did this at Penn State. It's like, how do you get that rye incorporated and dealt with? Particularly, to me, the ground is just so valuable. There was a summer early on when we weren't using this tunnel, and this was planted earlier, this was planted later, so there's nothing magical about why this is so much bigger. Compost tea, no. This is something you could incorporate and break down, and this farmer in Wisconsin has done that before successfully. But in general, I don't think you need to do that unless you have downtime in your tunnel. Then it would make sense to do that. The compost, you've got to get the quality. What we do to maintain our beds is we have what we call the 4-step process. So you could think about putting the compost on first. We don't do that, all right? So in double digging, right, you would dig down deep and you'd fork in that compost. What we do is we use the broad fork to loosen loosen the soil, okay? In that process, the compost that we put on the last time, like 2 or 3 months or before, that's sitting on top. When we lift with the broad fork, the soil cracks and that drops down deep, okay? After most all the nutrients are out of it already. So it's going down deep without a lot of nutrients, but it's helping with organic matter. Then we come in with the 3-pronged claw from Johnny's, all right, and break up the clumps and kind of smooth things out. Then we put on the compost, and then we rake it out, try to distribute that compost evenly, and then we'll go in with transplants or seeding. I'm not saying this is the way you have to do it. This is the way that we do it, and it works well. What I get then is the compost, new compost on the top, where those soluble nutrients that are in there are going to help. The surface has got organic matter on it, so it makes it easier to water and absorb the water. And it's a nice dark color, so it warms up faster. So that's some of the reasons we do it. Elliot in his books early on said that leave the compost on top and work it in later. I think these are some of the reasons why he's doing it also. Okay, makes sense? So what do we do with compost? Here's a hoop house going up. And so I am a big believer in nuking the place, if you can, with compost to get that ground prepared. That's my greenhouse mentality. I'm going to make thousands of dollars out of this greenhouse. I want it to be right before I build it. So here, this one's the one we built in 2008. I put in a couple yards of dairy compost, which is really giving me my nutrients. I put in a couple yards of leaf mold, and then a couple yards of the SOF compost, getting that diversity of microorganisms in there. I also, when we built this tunnel, you see how it's kind of raised up here in the middle? I hate to waste good dirt, and I did say dirt, not soil, but this is soil. Before we put these posts in here, I came in with my front end loader and scooped up the outside dirt and where I'm going to put my aisle on the inside, and I put this all up and just raised it up. Because I'm going to put bark along the edge here, and I'm going to put some gravel along the edge here, so why would I leave all that good soil underneath there? If you have a front end loader, it's something to do. It also creates somewhere for all the water to drain away, all right, which is a key part of doing the tunnel. When we're making compost, I started doing this small scale for our research, but we've done it large scale. Hay and straw, if I can, I get a grass hay and an alfalfa hay. So those are two greens. And then my browns are the straw and the wood shavings, okay? And then peat. And it's like, Biernbaum, you buy stuff to make compost? So I thought you make compost with stuff that people are getting rid of. And it's like, no, you can afford to buy stuff to make compost. I was teaching this at a garden center, and I had an elder crowd that was there on a Sunday afternoon, and they're looking at me, and when I'm telling them about buying this stuff to put in there, and I said, okay, here it is. I had a bag, I anticipated this, of 1 pound of blood meal. Okay, it came from in the garden center. It cost $10. Blood meal is 10% nitrogen. So in that $10 worth of blood meal, how many pounds of nitrogen do I have? 1/10 of a pound. Okay. Now I have this bale of hay. It weighs 50 pounds. Let's say that it has 4 or 5% nitrogen. For the sake of convenience, let's say 5% if it was alfalfa. Okay, 50 pounds. If it was 100 pounds, I'd have 5 pounds of nitrogen. So it's 50 pounds. So I have 2.5 pounds of nitrogen here. So I have 2.5 pounds, and I paid, let's say, $5 or $6 for this bale of alfalfa. And it's like, all of a sudden, I saw all these light bulbs flash, and everybody's demeanor changed, and they said, okay, we can move on now. It's like, because it's like, I got 2.5 pounds of nitrogen for $5, or I can give you 1/10 of a pound of nitrogen here for $10. Which would you want? Okay, and the answer is there. So you're buying nitrogen. Could you get this hay without buying it? Possibly. You could grow it, other things. But we make this compost, and Michael, who built this one, he was trained on a biodynamic farm, so he really piled it up nicely. And the peat in there keeps the pH down, helps capture nutrients. This was actually, we built this one more in the fall because we had a bunch of stuff we needed to get rid of, and it didn't heat up that much. But the next spring we came back in and added some stuff to it. How do you make these piles? I just come in on the side with the loader and just roll them over. So I have a spot where they're going to go, so they're sloping down this way. So if water comes, it can move away. And then I roll them that way, and then I roll them back the other way, and we make some really nice compost. I mean, we have the online compost course I'm teaching right now for the students. This is a key part of learning it. So that, again, you could add leaves to that. You could add your scraps from the farm, any number of things. You could put a little bit of manure in there if your soil test indicated that you needed more nitrogen or potassium.
The SOF compost, what does that stand for?
The Student Organic Farm is, and so it's just the mix. I also, lots of times I call it the transplant compost. Back when I was getting into this initially, the first thing I worked on as I transitioned from greenhouses to organic was organic transplants. And I did what I called the growers, what do you use? Fish emulsion, and that's, you could grow transplants in a peat-based media, with fish emulsion, but I hate the smell of fish emulsion, and I also don't think we should be harvesting fish out of the ocean for, making fertilizer. So that's where the transplant compost came. And then we also used that for our compost tea research, because at that point people were like freaking out about if there's manure in the compost, how do you make the tea? Well, manure is okay, but we don't have to have manure. And so we just made that. So we've been making that recipe for 10, 12 years, and it always heats up to 150 degrees within 3 days if you put enough water in it. And it takes a lot of water. If you have 5 each of the 2 hays, the straw, and the peat, and the shavings, it takes about 80 to 100 gallons of water to wet all that up. but it really works well. Something new, all right? Worm composting is a new thing about for us. 2010, the university was, we had shifted from all the food came in pre-prepped to a new person came in like 7 or 8, and goal, make the dining halls the best food in the country, which I think that he succeeded, okay? But we're bringing in all this fresh stuff. Every dining hall has multiple chefs. Raw, whole foods are brought in, whole chickens roasted, whole produce. Okay, so what do you do with all these scraps now that weren't there, 3 years before? One of the things they did was they built an anaerobic digester. First a research one for about $1 million, and now they just finished this summer a $4 million one on campus that has about a 10 to 15 year payback, and they're learning a lot about that. The whole idea is keep these nutrients out of the landfill and get them so they can go back to the farm. So I get invited to come to the meeting, and it's like we're already delivering lettuce up on the campus. So it's like, what if we start backhauling some of the scraps? And if we feed them to worms and make worm compost? Well, as you would guess, it got really quiet in that meeting. It's like, what? But everybody, I got my $25,000 and we went, and I show you, and we built a hoop house and we started doing the worm composting. I'd already done some stuff where I knew that it worked pretty good. Part of my question was, is worm compost any better than regular compost? And it's different. But one of the things we have to remember is that the majority of worm compost available for sale commercially in the U.S. comes from dairy manure. And dairy manure is high nutrients. So is it that the worm compost is higher than regular compost, or is it just because the worm compost is dairy manure, which also is higher if you hot compost it? So asking some of those questions is what we're after. And we know that we can come in with this compost and just sprinkle it over our flats, and they'll grow like that, and I don't have to smell fish emulsion. So I like that. Here's some rosemary where we dumped it on, and about 3 months prior to this, I put maybe a half a cup on each pot, and it just really makes a big difference. So I had learned about worms from what Will Allen was doing, and certainly what the Morgans are doing in this Elzinga's greenhouse in Kalamazoo. When he started up 4 acres of organic production of bedding plants and stuff, he bought $80,000 worth of worm compost in the first year, bringing it from New York State. Okay, so people are doing this. It's a beautiful material, at $800 a ton, and I can make some worm compost. And this place in New York is the largest worm composting facility in the country now, and it's all automated. He spent $10 million on that, and he's pumping out worm compost pretty fast. So I don't have $10 million, but for $10,000, oops, keep going, John. All right. Next slide. I built this 30 by 72 hoop house, and we started bringing in the worm compost. And what I was wanting to do was test, can we use the same method to keep the worms alive that we use to keep the vegetables alive? All right. And I had already done it the year before at home, just under my inside tunnel. I had a big Rubbermaid animal watering tank, a 70-gallon tank, and I just kept my worms going in there all winter long. And so here's the tunnel in a tunnel technology. It worked really well. We were able to keep the worm beds up at 50 degrees, and just like with the vegetables, we can show it's like below 20 outside. It's 25 in the hoop house, 32 in that tent, and 50 in the worm beds. And the worms aren't loving it at 50, but they're staying alive. And what I read later is the Chinese are doing this same technique. Outside worm composting in the summer, bringing the worms back in under poly cover in the winter, and making the worm compost for on-farm fertilizer. All right, here even in February we got 0, and we were 15 in the house, 25 under the tent, and 50 in the worm beds, and even a little bit warmer in the areas where the hot composting was happening. So we've been continuing this. In the summer, it's hard to keep the worms cool enough. That's why I think moving them outside in a shady spot is what we're working on. Right now, we've got beds in there that we keep them warm. And we've also done this box method. We actually bought some worms from Brad. This is 4 foot by 8 foot for $100. And the worms survived in that for the last couple winters. So this is starting to freeze around the edges this winter. But if you can make 2 or 3 yards of compost out of that, which would be enough to fertilize your transplants on your farm for a small farm, and you're using waste products. So it's got a lot of potential. We can also grow plants on top of those worm beds, and I took the slide out that I've since learned how to make a higher bench, because here every time we wanted to feed the worms we had to move the plants, but we've got that worked out for a really cheap bench system, just using conduit and 4x4s and pallets on top. All right, but this, we harvested close to $20 a square foot worth of basil out of these trays over a 10-week period. Okay, so you can grow, and this whole idea of actually just growing in straight compost is what I'm showing you. I'm going to skip all this. The certification does tell you what to do with how to get it to be certifiable for worm composting, but it doesn't tell you what density of worms you have to have. So the rules are pretty useless right now the way they are. But you could use this for the compost tea in Elzinga's. That's what they were doing, brewing big batches of tea and putting it through their irrigation system. Can you grow in 100% compost in the hoop house? This was the test. So we built this hoop house on campus after several years of planning. This is the Liberty Hyde Bailey greenhouse, Green, all capital. It's right next to the Liberty Hyde Bailey dorm. The university paid for this, a lot of money, but the soil was really bad, so we made cement beds and drainage lines in them, and then we brought in compost. The fall before, I took 60,000 pounds of post-consumer food waste from the dorm right around the corner here, about 200 yards around the corner. They hauled it to the farm. I combined it with stuff. I composted it really hot. It overwintered. We composted it some more in the spring. So this is like July 9th. We hauled 45 cubic yards of it up, put it in the beds, raked the lumps down because I didn't have a way of screening it. And a month later, we planted into that. This all got planted in one day. And a month later, we were harvesting. And that fall, we sold over $3,000 worth of culinary herbs to the university, just out of that little space. This year, we did close to $8,000 out of that space. And we have been growing for almost a year and a half, whatever it is, from September to now, and have fertilized nothing, but it's growing in 100% compost. Well-made compost that has soil in it, and that I check the nutrient levels, and this whole idea of how do we grow in the future. I think there's just lots of things that we can do. So we just made it through a lot of slides, and I think we're still got a few minutes for questions. There's lots of things, watching your yield. The work that Adam and Laura are doing with these loan programs, helping growers, get started. So we're doing consulting work. They get the loan and they get technical advice that's being paid for. They collect the data on the tomatoes, and we had everything from people who were getting like hardly any tomatoes to people, I don't know, I'm getting short on time here, just a lot of money. Like when they looked at calculating how much dollar per hour the owner was making, it went from minus $30 an hour to plus $30 an hour, okay? And this is because it's like sometimes I think people think that they don't know how to grow, but they're gonna get a hoop house and suddenly they're gonna know how to grow plants because they have a hoop house. It's like you have to learn how to grow first. The hoop house won't do the growing for you, but if you know how to grow, this hoop house can be an amazing tool to get you produce on a longer period of time, but also hopefully conserving nutrients, doing a system where we're going to get really healthy plants, and hopefully making us really healthy and sustainable, and hopefully conserving water and getting flavor. So lots of possibilities. It's all coming together, and I didn't put my slide in here. I'll have to see if at 4 or whatever I can still say it. It's all about integrating the farm, right? So up here, we get in the UP, it's colder. How are we going to have the local food system that John talked about? Some hoop houses, some cold storage, integrating animals and crops. Or what I've been saying for almost 10 years now, it's going to be farmers, friends, and families using facts and feelings to faithfully, physically, and fearlessly farm front yards, forests, and fields for food, feed, fodder, fiber, fuel, fertility, fun, freedom, fairness, and the future. Right?